I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss updates from the front lines of the war in Ukraine, analyse this week's tension in the Balkans, and talk about the potential Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson. Finally, Dom Nicholls interviews Ukraine's acting Deputy Head of the Military Intelligence.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 2nd of August, day 160. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Dom Nicholls, Senior Foreign Correspondent, Roland Oliphant, and Assistant Comment Editor, Francis Durnley. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Well, hi David. Hi everybody. There's been more fighting down in the south. These probing counterattacks that we've been seeing of late around the Kherson area seem to have continued. There was a HIMARS strike a couple of nights ago, or suspected HIMARS strike, given the range and precision. A train line coming out of Crimea, ostensibly moving towards the Kherson region. I think it was about 40 km southeast of the city itself, was struck, and there's footage on social media of very large explosions there, thought to be ammunition and possibly troops supporting or being moved into that area, as we've been talking about over the last few days. So it really does look as though that area is becoming the current operational focus for Ukraine, and by necessity, therefore, also the focus for Russia as they have to move troops around from the Donbass region, which really has done nothing much over the last couple of weeks, into the south to sort of shore up the positions there. Elsewhere, there's 5 people, three British men, plus 2 other men from Croatia and Sweden, been accused of mercenaries. They're going to stand trial in a proxy court. So these 3 guys, John Harding, Dylan Healy, and Andrew Hill. Andrew Hill being a military volunteer. They're going to be tried in the so-called Supreme Court of the Donetsk People's Republic. This is from Russia's news agency TASS. They're all said to be, or they're accused of foreign citizens, quote, foreign citizens accused of mercenarism. Not familiar with that word, but I guess that means mercenary. Somewhat ironic, given that the Wagner Group is very active in Russia. But that's what they're being accused of, and they're also they're said to have been members of Ukraine's Azov Battalion and other military units that were captured in Mariupol. So this is. I mean, we've seen this before. We are going to see this again. The Foreign Office have condemned it and condemned the exploitation of prisoners of war and civilians for political purposes. That's a quote. And they will continue to keep up that rhetoric, the Foreign Office. But I think we're going to see more of these kind of show trials. Not clear quite what will happen. Like others we've seen, another 2 recently. They could very well receive the death sentence that is, again, largely for show, although no less shocking and very, very worrying for the families involved for that. But we've seen prisoners being used not only for prisoner exchanges, which is quite normal, but also as political pawns, which is not normal, and that is absolutely against the Geneva Convention and subject against the rights of those that have been that are no longer combatants. And the only other thing to note, it's worth having a look at Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, the head of the National Security Council, Putin's one of Putin's closest aides. He's had another great night out. He's taken to social media and he's accusing Kazakhstan and Georgia, saying they're artificial states, and saying, quote, all the peoples inhabiting the once great and mighty USSR once again live together in friendship. Now, that's the end of the quote. That was quickly deleted, and Medvedev later claimed his account had been hacked. But I think when the vodka flows, the mask slips, and we see yet again the bigger picture for these guys. They really are just living in some fantasy world, regretting the end of the Cold War and end of the Soviet Union, and just doing making it very clear when in less guarded moments, very clear what their thinking is, underlining the threat not only to the clear threat to Ukraine, but also to their near abroad elsewhere, as if we needed reminding. But no, that's quite an interesting one from Dmitry Medvedev.
Thank you, Dom. Francis, can I turn to you? Vladimir Putin has been speaking to a keynote UN conference on nuclear war. What did he say, and why does it matter?
Yes, well, no one can win from a nuclear war, and it should never be unleashed. That's according to Vladimir Putin with regard to this conference on the non-proliferation treaty, which is currently being hosted, and the Russian president has made these remarks, which no doubt to our regular listeners will seem rather ironic, given that it's the Russians who have been saber-rattling most aggressively in recent months, and particularly Putin in terms of threatening the use of these weapons, Satan II, which can destroy European capitals before they'd have the time to react, supposedly. These are the weapons that are currently being developed. So, yes, it rather interesting remarks, to say the least, and it's been met by similar confusion, I think it's fair to say, from other Western powers. So the US, Britain and France have rebuked Russia for its irresponsible and dangerous talk about possibly deploying nuclear weapons, saying that the ties between Russia and the West have been unravelling over the course of the conflict. But Putin nonetheless remains defiant, has insisted that Moscow has consistently remained faithful to the non-proliferation treaty's letter and spirit in his address. So I don't think we should read necessarily too much into it, apart from the fact that it does obviously mark a change in tone from the start of the invasion, when he was obviously consistently making thinly veiled threats about his willingness to deploy nuclear weapons. But nonetheless, I think this should be seen as just another example of Putin saying one thing and doing another, and shouldn't really be seen as being too much more significant than that. You can never trust really anything that he says or the Russian state says in any of these diplomatic remarks.
Before we bring in Roland to talk about Serbia and Kosovo, Dom, I realise you want to say something quickly on nukes before you head off.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that actually, despite the current bellicose language from Russia, the idea of cooperating in the nuclear realm has been quite stable in the last few decades. Russia and before that the Soviet Union and America have actually cooperated pretty well over the years on bringing down the numbers. And I mean, Biden, they're trying to put this current thing in New York. They're trying to push to get on the road for a new START treaty, START being the Strategic Arms Reduction talks. The current one expires in 2026. So there is work ongoing on that, and it has been a rare area of cooperation. I would say very, very soft C cooperation. However, if that starts to unravel, that is not only very serious, because America and Russia have by far and away the world's greatest number of nuclear warheads, and you just don't want ambiguity here. You do want this to be the rare outbreak of common sense, and an area where you can meet and discuss sensibly, an area of extreme global import. But of course, the other thing is that China is not part of the current mechanisms, and therefore, if these things are allowed to unravel, and if there is disagreement over how you talk about them, let alone any type of controlling of the numbers between America and Russia, then that gives China absolutely no reason whatsoever to try and engage with this process, and to I wouldn't say come in from the cold, but to engage sensibly on this matter of extreme global importance. So I think this is very worrying what we're seeing between Russia and America. They have cooperated. They are currently cooperating, although the edges are fraying slightly. And any move away from this reasonably close cooperation and an outbreak of common sense is very, very worrying, as I say, for its own right, and for also the lessons that China would take from it. And if there's anything that they take from it to say, well, there's no need for us to engage, we just don't need to get involved because the whole thing's falling apart anyway, then that is very worrying indeed. And that's not to say there are other actors in the background most notably North Korea, Iran, India, Pakistan, Israel, thought / known to be nuclear powers themselves, and others aspiring to that status, that if they see these global understandings, these global treaties unraveling, and they see the new big boy on the block, China, not taking part, then it just means that they will take the message as well that these things are not worth engaging in. So somewhat a worrying development there for nuclear diplomacy. No pun intended. Slow burn, but definitely one to keep an eye on.
If I could just come on back on that, Dom is absolutely right to talk about the cooperation that's been going on between the nuclear powers up until now. I mean, it feels like a lifetime ago, but it was only in January that the 5 members of the UN Security Council, so that the US, China, Russia, Britain and France, actually pledged to prevent the further dissemination of nuclear weapons. So, it just speaks to the fact that there has been cooperation on this issue. But although I believe it was back in 2015 that the parties were unable to actually reach agreement on the substantive issues about how best to do that, and just speaking to the inherent danger in all of this is at this conference in New York that's opened yesterday. The UN Secretary General warned that the world now faces, quote, nuclear danger not seen since the height of the Cold War. Humanity is just one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. So strong words, of course, but nonetheless, I think, as Dom says, there has actually been a lot of progress since the Cold War on this issue, and there are considerably fewer nuclear weapons in the world now than there were at the nuclear war at the height of the Cold War. But nonetheless, of course, one could argue that one such weapon that's being utilised as a possibility and being talked about in the way that Vladimir Putin had is one too many.
I'd just like to add quickly that when we were in, Dom and I were in Ukraine last week, we interviewed Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, and when one of my questions to him was, we do see, I think, that there's less interest in the war from international media. What does he say to that? And one of his response was the nuclear question. I mean, he said, look, there are 5 big nuclear power plants in Ukraine. If something happens to one of them, if there's an accident or if they're shelled or if there's a leak of radiation, then that will have an impact not just on Ukraine, but potentially the whole of Europe and the world. So it was certainly something that the top echelons of of Ukraine are thinking quite deeply and carefully about. Roland, you've been listening to all of this. I just wondered if you had anything to add, any comments before we move on to talking about Serbia and Kosovo.
Oh, nuclear stuff scares me. No, I think that's very, very well covered. I mean, I was down on the opposite side of the banks of the River Dnipro the day the Russians stormed into the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and around there was serious worry. The local authorities were handing out, iodine tablets to give to the population. Take this in case there's a leak, and so on and so forth. Genuine worry, and of course, all of these towns and these areas have evacuation plans that are based on the lessons of Chernobyl. I remember speaking to the mayor of this place. He said, yes, we have got an evacuation plan, but it requires moving about 60,000 people in 3 hours on buses, and no one thought there would be a war going on, so it's not going to happen. So yes, extremely worrying, and one would hope that some kind of common sense would prevail.
Yeah, just on this issue of Zaporizhzhia, I mean, there's been some very interesting remarks overnight from the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, calling Russia's actions around Ukraine's largest nuclear power plant the height of irresponsibility, accusing Moscow of using it as a nuclear shield in attacks on Ukrainian forces. The idea being that, of course, if they have their military base near this power plant, then the Ukrainian forces aren't able to fire on them, but the Russians are able to fire back. So this is hence why Antony Blinken has described this as a nuclear shield, as opposed to a sort of human shield. And as Roland says, of course, there's huge concerns about what could happen in the worst case scenario. We've seen Chernobyl. We've seen other examples in recent years of where nuclear plants have failed. So that's obviously concerning, and it's concerning to the whole world at the moment. Hence why the UN have also issued a statement sort of talking, obviously condemning these actions, and also the Russians have put forward a reply saying, "We repeatedly state that the actions of our armed forces in no way undermine Ukraine's nuclear security or impede routine operation of the power plant." Well, one can obviously heavily dispute that, as is what is being done, but nonetheless, think it important to mention what both sides are saying on this.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Roland, and thank you, Dom. And Dom, we realise that you might have to jump off, but if you do want to stay listening or do want to add to anything, please, of course, jump in. Can we talk about Serbia and Kosovo? There's been some tensions on the border in recent days. Roland Oliphant, what's happening, and what's the relevance to the war in Ukraine?
Right, so quite late on Sunday night, and I know this because I was just putting the finishing touches to the foreign pages because I was on editing duty. Suddenly we started getting reports of something happening on the border of Serbia and Kosovo, gunfire, assault. Some people saying that President Vučić of Serbia was about to order an invasion, or that Prime Minister Albin Kurti of Kosovo was about to order an invasion of the ethnic Serbian kind of enclaves in the northern part of Kosovo. What had actually happened, it turned out, is Serbian activists from the northern part of Kosovo, where there is a large kind of Serbian minority, had taken big lorries filled with gravel and blockaded the roads at several border crossings. Now, this is in protest against a proposed law which had been flagged back in June by the Kosovan government. So they knew this was going to happen. Everyone knew it was going to kick in on August the 1st, which is why the protest happened on the Sunday night. And that law basically says it says two things. One is that you're going to have to, if you're driving around with Serbian plates and you're a resident of Kosovo, you're going to have to change them for Kosovan plates. And the other thing is, if you are a traveller coming in from Serbia on Serbian papers, you'll have to exchange your documents for temporary travel documents issued by the Kosovan authorities. Now, the Kosovans say this is simply a purely reciprocal measure, and it's intended to reflect exactly what the Serbs do when Kosovans go into Serbia, which a lot of them do. There's a lot of movement across that border. This is all, it's quite Balkan and complicated, but it's quite important to understand these points. So the Serbs, since they do not recognise the independence of Kosovo, say when a Kosovan citizen comes across the border, as far as we're concerned, you're a Serbian citizen because we think Kosovo is part of Serbia. Therefore, we're going to say you've lost your documents for whatever reason. Here is a 3-month or whatever temporary travel document. Off you go. And it works quite well. So the Kosovans feel that they are perfectly within their rights to implement a reciprocal mirror image measure to kind of assert their sovereignty. The Serbs say, no, this is a terrible assault on freedom of movement, and so on. Now, this is not a new thing. So you may remember back in September, there was a huge standoff over a similar issue around number plates. Again, the Kosovans saying we're doing this because the Serbs already do it. It's simply about sovereignty. It's not going to inconvenience anyone. Barricades again. It escalated to President Vučić sending his army down to the border, big show of force, a small little war scare which never turned into a war. This is a problem that obviously goes all the way back to 1999 and everything connected with that war, and the fact that Serbia is never going to accept Kosovo's independence and so on. It's a very long-running thing. But in the context of the Ukraine war, everything is now in the context of the Ukraine war. Serbia is a close Russian ally, and there are serious fears, obvious jitters in Western capitals that the Kremlin may persuade President Vučić to stir up some trouble in the Balkans as a way of distracting the West from what's going on in Ukraine. And hence, as soon as this news broke on kind of pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian social media, on the Telegram channels, things like that, you had both sides basically predicting a full-scale war in the Balkans. So I was reading these pro-Russian kind of military Telegram channels, which are usually kind of talking all about, how many Ukrainians we've killed and stuff in Ukraine. Suddenly saying, right, that's it. The Kosovans are about to start an ethnic cleansing campaign against the Serbs in Kosovo, and Serbia will have to invade, and they'll have to and President Vucic is about to appeal to the Kremlin for Russian military support, which obviously didn't happen. On the other hand, you had, kind of pro-Ukrainian voices saying, right, this is it. Putin's forced his puppet in the Balkans to do this. And there's going to be a big war, and basically there's a new front. Now, I think that Western powers, Western governments seem to take this pretty seriously because they jumped on this quick. All right, so within a couple of hours, the US ambassador and the EU ambassador had been to see Prime Minister Kurti of Kosovo, and he had agreed to put back this rule change by a month. And that seems to have diffused things for at least 30 days. So, takeaways. War in the Balkans has not broken out. It's definitely a tense situation and it shouldn't be underplayed. We're going to be looking at it again in 30 days on the 1st of September. But even though everybody involved in Ukraine is watching the Balkans very carefully, we shouldn't forget these are long-running issues with their own grievances, which long predate. It's a fault line that long predates the current war and has its own dynamics.
Well, thank you, Roland. That was incredibly comprehensive. Dom, Francis, do you have any questions about this that our listeners might find useful?
Yeah, just one for me, if I may. Hi, Roland. So, you've covered it quite extensively there that this is not directly related to Ukraine, but just wonder what you thought Vladimir Putin might take from this, whether or not he'd be pleased that there is a little bit of a rumble elsewhere in Europe that tangentially involves NATO, because, of course, there's the KFOR soldiers still there, have been since 1999, or whether this would be a distraction for Putin, and he doesn't want anything to detract from what's happening in Ukraine. Just be interested in your thoughts there.
I think probably for Putin, anything that stretches NATO thinner or has the West worried is to his advantage. He's not really in a position to directly assist Serbia in a shooting war if it were to happen at this stage, and that there have long been concerns in the West that he was planning to do that. So there's this thing in the city of Niš in southern Serbia called the Russian Humanitarian Center. And if you go there, I was given a tour of it by this very, very friendly man from the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situation a couple of years ago. And it's kind of firemen's training stuff. It's stuff for responding to floods, and it's meant to be a gift of friendship for helping the Serbs respond to, I don't know, if there are forest fires or if the Danube floods or something like that. It seems pretty much taken by kind of Western intelligence agencies that no, that is a forward logistics hub, and it's meant to be turned into a logistics hub if Russia ever wants to, quickly fly in military support in the event of a conflict. And also they think it's a spy hub. The Russians deny that, obviously. So those fears exist, and there's definitely serious rhetoric that would suggest an effort to stir things up. So I definitely think Putin would welcome it.
Thank you, Roland, for that. As I said, that was very comprehensive. There's two big things I think we should talk about. One, firstly, Roland, you've been doing a lot of talking, so we'll go to Francis first. Francis, yesterday we had Louis Ashworth, our economics reporter, talking about how some experts think the economic impact of sanctions within Russia might be far greater than the Kremlin is revealing or telling us. You've had some thoughts on this. What do you think?
Yes, well, it was really interesting hearing Louis' summary of this fascinating Yale paper on the economic impact of the sanctions thus far. And I thought he summarised it incredibly well. This talk about, despite the lingering leakiness, Russian imports have largely collapsed. Russia's strategic positions as a commodities exporter has irretrievably deteriorated. I mean, it's very, very strong stuff, and I would recommend that people listen to it. But I wanted to take a slightly different angle on this, which is, whilst I think one can't dispute the economic impact of the sanctions on Russia, that doesn't mean that we should, it's all, plain sailing from the Western perspective. All it is a matter of time until suddenly there's some sort of internal implosion. And so I wanted to look a little bit at the actual reaction within Russia to the sanctions. And there's been some more, I suppose, concerning reading that's come out on this. I'm thinking particularly of a book by Richard Connolly, published by Cambridge University Press, which he summarised in the Sunday Times last weekend, where he essentially spoke about sanctions inadvertently pushing Russia's elite closer to Putin's state and accelerating its turn to China. So one of his arguments is that sanctions often create opportunities for enrichment, that the price of goods that are sanctioned rise sharply, offering the political leadership in the target country an opportunity to transfer resources to key political allies who promise to supply these goods. So it can again draw people in closer to the state in that way. Second, the longer sanctions remain in place, the more the target country can adjust to the new circumstances. One could argue, of course, that's already happening in Russia. The collapse in the value of the ruble in March being a case in point. In the early days of the war, this was presented as sort of a successful Western policy. However, adaptive measures have now kicked in within Russia, and they've obviously put in capital controls, etc. And whilst the ruble remains weak, it's remained perhaps slightly more static than was expected. And so there's evidence that of course, as well, it brings, for all the reasons that we've talked about in the podcast previously, the Russian people feel that this plays into a narrative of the West sort of always being the enemy that Putin, of course, has been peddling for many, many years. And so you've got this situation where, whilst the sanctions are working, this isn't necessarily moving them away from Putin as a leader. And indeed, there has been obviously numerous polls that we've cited on this podcast that suggest that support for Putin still remains strong, particularly in rural areas, whilst there's more skepticism in cities, that this still remains something that is broadly supported given the propaganda that they are receiving and everything else. So I just wanted to flag that whilst it's certainly true, I think, that perhaps the narrative that we've started to see in recent weeks, that the Russian economy actually has proved rather more robust than we believed, is not true. That actually this is having a hugely damaging consequence, which will not be sustainable long term. That does not yet mean at the same time that this is likely to shorten the war, at the very least, shorten Putin's reign in power. It could have the opposite impact. Now, just one other thought on this is, what do you do when the market is able to essentially adapt? I mean, one of the big problems that have obviously occurred in recent days, really, is that as the price of oil and gas has gone up, whilst less is being bought by European powers, the amount of money that Russia makes still remains incredibly high because of this price rise. And so there was a very interesting New York Times editorial, which I would point people to read, about a American plan to essentially avert this by establishing a buyer's cartel. So an agreement among Russia's customers to put a price ceiling on Russian oil that would be considerably lower than the market price, but would still mean that they would be buying the oil, but it would be ensuring that the Russia can't profit over considerably more than they would otherwise have been able to. So I think that there's some interesting conversations that are taking place here around making sure that the robustness and strength of sanctions continues as the market adapts and the value of Russian energy goes up. But nonetheless, as I say, the concerning thing, and no doubt this is a central conversation that's taking place in European capitals around the world, particularly amongst the intelligence communities, is what does this mean for the support for the war within Russia? And indeed, as I say, the jury is very much out on that.
Thank you, Francis. Roland, just quickly, obviously with your Russians, with your Russian, have you picked up much on how people within the country or without are sort of dealing with sanctions, or how it's impacting their daily lives at all?
Do you know what I think? My impression, I haven't been back to Russia since the war began, but my impression is a lot of people are kind of able to pretend that life is more or less normal to a surprising degree. The sanctions, as far as I'm aware, haven't really begun to really hit and bite ordinary people. But, a few months ago, people were saying, look, and based on kind of projections by Russia's own central bank and Ministry of Finance, that, people are going to start running out of savings. Companies are going to start running out of reserves, things like that, probably around September, October. Right? Autumn is when people have been predicting this is really going to bite. And that, I think, autumn is going to be difficult for the West as well, obviously, but we're all looking, with very, very nervously at the coming energy crisis and what Russia's going to do with the gas supply. It's also going to be a big test for Russia. So my impression at the moment is that people are, a lot of them, surprisingly, especially in those big cities, able to kind of carry on with their lives pretty much as it was before, and managing in one way or another to kind of not even think about the war. But I think, there is a chance that this tidal wave is coming, and things are going to start getting a lot more difficult for a lot more people. Again, like so much in war, it's unpredictable. You don't know it's going to hit until it hits. You don't know if it's going to work until it does. But if I was in the Kremlin, I'd be very nervous about how they're going to manage this winter.
Thanks, Roland. The last big thing I think we should talk about actually is with you, Roland. You've been thinking about and writing about the potentially incoming counterattack in Kherson. Could you give us a sense of your thoughts of what the Ukrainians are planning, how possible it might be, and what should our listeners be paying attention to in the next few weeks?
Yeah, so I mean, to break it down into kind of armchair general arrows on a map kind of stuff, there's basically 4 bridges which are key to this. The first one, of course, is the Antonovsky Bridge, which goes into a suburb of Kherson, just to the east of the city, where the river's about 500 meters wide. That's the road bridge that was famously hit by the HIMARS and put out of action the other week. That was the most important bridge across the Dnieper that the Russians controlled. That was where they were getting most of their supplies, and it was also the bridge that most civilians were using. That's now pretty much out of action, we think, and very unlikely to be repaired. Go half a mile up the river, there's a railway bridge. Now the Russians, that I believe has been hit quite recently actually, but the Russians have stopped using that because of the HIMARS strikes on the ammunition dumps at railheads, because they're realizing if we bring our trains across right up to the front and we unload our ammunition, which is what they've been doing for most of the war, suddenly that's incredibly vulnerable to these high precision strikes. They've stopped using that. So that's kind of out of action. So their main bridge now across the Dnieper, their last proper bridge across the Dnieper, is up at a place called Novokharkova. If you look on a map, that's about 30 miles upstream. There is a hydroelectric dam there, and that's more difficult for the Ukrainians because if you hit that, you're going to release the reservoir behind it, and there's a risk of a catastrophic flood that's going to kill an awful lot of people. I've heard people saying things like it would destroy everything 800 meters on either side of the river. So you don't want to blow up that dam, tempting as it may be. But that creates a bottleneck. And then, so every Russian truck has to go across that bridge. They turn left, they come down, they have to drive 30 miles down the bank to get to Kherson. Along the way, there is a tributary of the Dnieper called the Inhulets, and there's another bridge there which the Ukrainians have been hitting. So those are the 4 bridges that they want to take out. And the idea is basically the Russians are going to be, out of heavy weapons, out of ammunition, out of resupply, and they're going to be incredibly vulnerable. Now, the question is, to my mind, whether the Russians decide to make defending it a priority, because go back to World War II, which is what the Russians love to do. Think about the Battle of Stalingrad, very similar situation. This small foothold that the Soviets had in a city on the far side of the Volga. They are having to bring in all their supplies overnight on barges. They're extremely vulnerable to the Luftwaffe, but they held on, and they kept on until a counterattack could be put in, around the sides, and we all know how that ended. So there's 2 big questions. One is, when can the Ukrainians really get the capacity together to really launch the offensive, because we're still in the probing kind of stages now. And the second question is, how much effort are the Russians going to put into kind of trying to sustain a foothold despite these logistical problems, maybe sending people across on ferries across the river at night or something like that. If they can get infantry in there and they really decide, and those infantry are motivated and they want to fight, they could make Kherson a real meat grinder, something like Mariupol, and that would slow down the Ukrainians, and that would play to the Russians' advantages in men, basically. So that, I think, is the thing to look out for. I think the Ukrainians are going to try and put this thing to bed, by the end of summer. Summer lasts till about September in southern Ukraine.
Maybe Francis on the history and Dom on the military side, would you like to come in and add anything or ask any questions?
Well, I just say it was very interesting hearing Roland talk about the Battle of Stalingrad. There's another interesting echo in all of this, which is from the German perspective during the Battle of Stalingrad, they believe that they could hold out once they were sort of becoming surrounded by the Russians. And I think it was the Luftwaffe who basically made the promise that they would be able to continue to supply the Germans for considerably for longer, by doing a sort of Berlin airlift style resupply over many weeks and months, but they were not able to do so. And I don't know, it just sort of reminds me of how Russia has, throughout the start of this war, has been making all sorts of pronouncements about its resupply capability, about its military prowess, about the number of tanks it has and everything else. And it speaks to that kind of rhetoric and overconfidence and indeed arrogance that Nazi Germany had in its Russian campaign, that ultimately making these promises that were not able to actually be delivered cost them not only Stalingrad but arguably the entirety of the Eastern Front. So that would just be my only observation.
The only thing I'd add is that I think Ukraine are going to be going back to their books, going to be rereading their Sun Tzu, because I think what they definitely do not want to do is get decisively engaged with Russia. We've seen Russia just don't care about how many people die here, civilians, soldiers from either side, and what have you. So they're not going to give up that area without a fight. They'd be quite happy to fight in the streets of Kherson, and urban combat is just horrifically much worse than fighting in rural areas. I mean, the ratios of attacker to defender for a successful attack goes through the roof. We say about 3-1 for rural areas. It's at least 5 or 6 to 1. Probably higher nowadays in urban areas. So it would be a horrific attack in the tight confines of a city, where you lose all your advantage of long range precision strike, because it's just so difficult in there. So Russia would be quite happy for the fight to descend into that. Ukraine, as I said, one of the things that Sun Tzu said, the ancient Chinese military strategic genius, said you don't necessarily want to totally surround your enemy, because then he's got nowhere to go and he has to fight and he comes at you hard. If you leave an avenue out, or a couple of avenues out, it always just leaves a seed of doubt in their mind that, I don't have to do this fight. I can actually try and make a run for it if I want to. So I wouldn't be surprised if Ukraine allow an area or an avenue out. It might be the dam that Roland was talking about, because, as you say, you don't want to destroy that in the first place. But it's very handy to channel your adversary, but also quite handy to give them a route out, so they can, if the Russian army cracks and folds, they've got a way out. They might take that option, and then it's always a lot easier. Again, back to the Sun Tzu, to win a battle without, or not easier. It's preferable to win a battle without fighting than actually have to get decisively engaged, because Ukraine just simply do not have the personnel here. So Russia would be quite happy to get decisively engaged and up close and personal in the kind of meat grinder war. Ukraine absolutely have to avoid that at all costs, and I think there are going to be a lot of shaping operations to try and coerce the Russian army into committing to a course of action before Ukraine has to just get in there in the close battle and start sort of winkling out at the point of the bayonet. So a lot more shaping actions to come, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were some routes left open for the Russian army to withdraw through.
No doubt that's a calculation that's currently taking place amongst the Ukrainian High Command, which is, if they have the capacity to form this encirclement or not. I mean, just to Dom's point, it's absolutely true that you would want somebody to potentially have a way out, but if you don't feel that you can otherwise defeat them, and that it would a huge sapping of your strength to hold them there and to have this sort of holdout. But at the same time, I would just sort of say that, of course, from the Ukrainian perspective, they are going to be very sensitive to the fact that they are going to want to have and deliver a knockout blow on Russia soon. At the very least, something symbolic, whether that be the siege of Kherson or a huge military defeat of the Russians, because of the war on other fronts, particularly in terms of international opinion, in terms of energy, and all of these things. They are very sensitive, I think, to the growing sense that Ukraine has to show that they are making progress that can lead to an ultimate victory. Otherwise, there may well be sort of some more serious questions being asked. And indeed, I think it's also important to say that, of course, it's all well and good saying that you're pushing for, giving the Russians an escape route. But at the end of the day, if you still believe that you're going to have to fight them somewhere, it's probably better to fight them when you've got them in a situation of being encircled. I mean, there are numerous examples in Second World War of where, for example, they weren't able to completely encircle the German forces around around the Falaise Gap in 1944. And by not doing so, it had huge ramifications for the rest of that campaign. And some historians even argue that if the Allies had managed to close the Falaise Gap and the German soldiers who were in there that had not been able to escape, then that may well have meant that the war would have been shortened by several months, and maybe even Operation Market Garden, which was of course a failed attempt to end the war early, may well have been successful. So there are numerous military campaigns where if you think a big fight is going to come, then you may well want to do so in a way. But as Dom was saying, I don't think that the Ukrainians feel they probably have the capacity to do so yet. So it's probably more likely that they will let them escape. But this is a big, I think, no doubt a big conversation and calculations that are being made in Ukraine, because they're going to need to have some sort of, I think, victory that could be pointed out soon that the West can then respond to, and that will hopefully bring them more support.
Well, thank you, Francis, Roland and Dom, for that and for all of your expertise and your reporting. We've probably run out of time here, I think, unfortunately. Can I just get your final thoughts? What should our listeners be thinking of in the next few days? What should they be looking to and thinking about in the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Francis or Roland, I don't know, or Dom, actually, because I know you might have to head off. Would you like to go first?
Yes, I mean, it's slightly out of the way, but I really would keep an eye on the reaction to Nancy Pelosi's expected visit to Taiwan. She's due to land, I think, in the next hour and a half. And this could be extremely provocative to China, although they've been fairly muted so far, apart from rolling a few amphibious vehicles up and down the beaches. But interestingly, Russia have come out to denounce this visit, I think, just trying to court Beijing. But it will be interesting to see both from Russia, China and the US point of view, the comms that are put out about this, if indeed, as looks likely, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, does arrive in Taipei in the next couple of hours.
I would just echo that. I think it's going to be very, very interesting seeing what takes place on this, because, of course, it all plays into the much broader geopolitical themes that we've touched on this podcast so often, which is the shift perhaps of Russia towards China becoming more robust on its foreign policy in reaction to where the West becoming more robust. All of these questions, I think, will be very interesting to see whether the visit does indeed go ahead. Just one other thing I wanted to flag, which is we've talked so much on this podcast about Germany and its reaction to the energy crisis that is unfolding. But I just wanted to point to an interesting piece of analysis by Javier Blas in Bloomberg, who points to the fact that actually Paris is arguably facing an even colder, darker winter than Berlin is, in the sense that France is actually more vulnerable than Germany to blackouts once the weather turns colder. And he goes into all sorts of analysis of why this might be the case. But effectively, it's that France is only able to run about 26 of its 57 reactors at the moment, and there's concerns that it sort of faces an electricity Waterloo. The slump in nuclear availability is forcing France to rely even more on gas-fired plants, intermittent wind and hydro, and in a worst-case scenario, they actually may be suffering as much, if not more severely, than the Germans. And of course, this will also spill out into the rest of Europe as well, because France is a major energy exporter, and indeed, the EDF is actually, I believe, currently made an emergency request to the British energy networks for extra power. So I just wanted to mention that, because I've been talking a lot about the energy issue in recent weeks, and often in the context of Germany. But I think it's worth saying that whilst France, of course, still has nuclear power, unlike Germany, or obviously that's an ongoing discussion in Germany at present following the war, but even so, France is still able to do it. That doesn't mean that they've got off the hook. They are still reliant enough on Russian energy that they may well still be feeling the pinch too, and that will have a big impact across the whole continent.
Thank you, Francis and Dom. Roland, would you like the final words?
Yeah, thank you. The Balkans, look, as I said, it has its own dynamics. It's complicated. It is, things that have nothing to do with Russia and Ukraine and so on. But my God, it is worth keeping an eye on that. We were talking about it earlier. Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, was very quick out the door on Sunday to basically predict a NATO-backed Kosovan attempt to ethnically cleanse Serbs from northern Kosovo and so on. I think it's naive to say that Vucic would do anything Putin tells him, but there's real nerves around that. And 30th of September coming up, if they haven't found a way of resolving this issue, it's going to be back, and things might get somewhat interesting. One other thing, we were talking about Kherson and the south. We are pretty sure that the Russians are heavily reinforcing down in the south, and there is an interesting kind of operational security discipline going on down there. We're not quite sure where they're going or what they're doing, but the fight in Kherson is going to be bad. There's also suggestions of a Russian spoiling offensive into Zaporizhzhia, which would change things. And don't forget about Donbass. We've seen reports over the past couple of days. If you look at what Ukrainian officials are saying, there does now appear to be fighting basically on the outskirts of Bakhmut, and back in May, the fighting was a good couple of dozen kilometers away from there. So Russian pressure is still there, and all this talk about an offensive is all well and good. But I think the Ukrainians are going to be keeping an eye on their eastern flank. Can they keep on holding that down long enough for that offensive to go in? Because the Russians are still taking little bits of ground.
As regular listeners to this podcast will know, Dom Nicholls and I spent last week in Ukraine. Before our return, Dom had a chance to meet the acting deputy head of Kyiv's military intelligence, Major General Vadim Skibitsky. He recorded some of the discussion to share with Ukraine the latest listeners. Before Dom started recording, Major General Skibitsky said that the military intelligence's number one priority was human-led intelligence, also known as HUMIT.
Mr. Skibitsky, welcome and thank you for giving some time to the Telegraph. It's very interesting you have HUMIT as your number one priority. That is delightfully against the sort of modern way of the world where everyone's trying to buy technology. Why have you prioritised human intelligence? I know there's a lot of technical aspects to it, but the human intelligence as your number one priority.
In our military intelligence, it is a bit different than the system that you have in UK, US, or in NATO, for instance, where human capital, human intelligence is one of the cornerstones of our activity. And in most the other partner countries, you don't have this kind of huge selection of agents and human resources who are working on these tasks. This is because in 2015 there was an ambitious task set for us to get into the decision-maker centers of our adversaries. For us it's very easy to work with our adversary, namely the country what we're talking about, because we used to share same language, same appearance as people, and until the recent time, there was also a similar mentality, and we used to be one country. Therefore, a lot of Ukrainians used to live or still living in Russia. There are many Ukrainians who are actually currently in decision-making circles in Russia who were born in Ukraine, but then moved at some point in the past and worked in Russia and established very good state career there. But they have their relatives, their parents here, friends, they used to study here and in Russia, therefore we have plenty of spectrum of different people whom we can consider.
But these people are undeclared to Russia? They are working for you unknown to Russia, or are they more open in their assistance to you?
Розумієте, понятно, що це вся активність. Obviously it is a covered activity because there is very intense counter-intelligence regime in Russia, and therefore whenever you openly declare some sympathy to Ukraine, so you're going to be punished. So the severity of the laws on punishment even much higher than they used to be under KGB times.
Do you think Vladimir Putin has any idea how big your coverage is in his country?
Мабуть, все-таки має, да, тому що у нього одна ідея повністю взяти під контроль. Yes, he might probably knows about this, but he has his grand idea or idea fix in his mind to take control all over Ukraine, and he's not giving up on that, regardless of all these kind of considerations. It looks like he was sticking to this idea for quite some time, but he started to express it openly only on the end of 2021, 2022, when he started to make these historical comparisons with the Greater Russia and the role of Russia in the immediate neighborhood. But presumably he was getting on that for quite a long time.
You had exceptionally good intelligence, or you were very accurate in your assessment of the invasion prior to February the 24th. Is that largely because of this network you have in Russia?
Да, в тому числі. В тому числі ми, як кажуть, ми не помилилися.
Yes, partially because of this factor, and we were not mistaken in our predictions, in our data. It was, we were talking about 15th of February. It was Putin who just postponed the date of invasion. So he listened twice to reports of the Minister of Defense and the head of the general staff of armed forces in Russia, and from the first report he made a conclusion that they were not ready for invasion, therefore he decided to postpone it. And also because he likes this kind of historical matching of data, he dedicated this to the 23rd of February 2014, when actually the war in Crimea started. Putin is a great fan of this kind of historical parallels, and therefore he likes to follow that.
So what is your network saying now Putin's ambitions are, and how much further he wants to go now he's seen the level of resistance from Ukraine?
Дуже просто. Основна ціль стратегічна у нас залишається. Це захоплення і знищення повністю.
The main strategic goal remains the same. It's capture, invasion, and total destruction of Ukraine as a state. And he's not likely to stop. So he doesn't have any room for maneuver. So the only way for him is just to continue with this penetration and not just to withdraw. And if you understood that in 2014-15 he wanted to get entire Ukraine with all the human resources, economic resources, and territory. These days the perception is different. He understands right now that the resistance of Ukrainians is extremely high and strong. Therefore, he destroys everything which he sees as obstacle to achieve this strategic goal. He'd like to achieve by this two goals as a minimum. To show that Ukraine as a state is not capable to protect and defend its country and its people, and to create a sense of fear and panic within the Ukrainian population, to decrease the level of resistance.
Russia's humid coverage of your country must have been a lot lower than yours is of Russia, for him to decide that the population would have welcomed his forces. So do you take strength that there must be far fewer Russian agents in your country than you have in his?
Їхня оцінка була, що населення буде їх зустрічати точно так.
They were confident that they would be met by Ukrainians likewise they were in Donetsk or in Crimea in 2014. But within these 8 years, the attitude towards Russia has been changed significantly within Ukrainian population. So it was already a completely different picture than they saw in 2014. Obviously, it was a huge underestimation from Russian side, but they obviously had a number of agents, and also there were subversive groups and reconnaissance groups that were just sent to Ukraine on the eve of war within nearest months, and they've created a network of them who were just gathering information, collecting data, and sending this about the allocation of Ukrainian military regiments and armed forces. Therefore, the first months of war was extremely difficult. So we had to identify them, detect them, neutralize them, but it doesn't mean that we've got rid of all of them. These days, the goal to collect and gather data about the military assistance that is coming to Ukraine from Western partners is the goal number one for Russian agents and for all those who are operating on Ukraine's territory. It's difficult to tell in numbers of concrete people, but we know that they use all kind of intelligence and data collection they might have. It's aerial reconnaissance, it's space intelligence, it's agents who are working, collaborators from Ukrainian side. They all try together allocate this information and Russians actually have enough information about that. You can imagine that Ukraine being as big as France, for instance, having 2,500 kilometers of front line, definitely it requires vast number of resources to detect and to neutralize these kind of people because they are working all over the huge country.
And are these people watching the border crossing points? Are they in towns? Are they in Lviv? Are they that far west? Are they in Poland? Are they at the Rezal airfield watching what's coming in? How far have they spread?
Ну, на перший погляд, переміщення людей зараз іде.
The movement of people is quite intense these days. And if it could be seen that the control over all this is not very strong, this is not the case. The control from the side of military intelligence over all this movement of different people who might be engaged in this kind of
on special forces, special bodies of Ukraine, not only the military and all.
So there is entire mechanism working actually on detecting and neutralizing these kind of persons. For instance, it's not just about the special intelligence services and forces, but also police, also ordinary Ukrainians who are involved in this kind of detecting some newcomers or strangers in their local areas and reporting about that to respective authorities. So everybody is working just like one entire body because it is about existence of Ukraine.
Приведу один приклад тільки.
One example for you.
От, ми на своєму сайті
For instance, we've placed announcement or notification at our website for the citizens of Ukraine who live in Energodar, the city where the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is located. Now it is temporary occupied territories, but nevertheless. We've just set up a hotline and asked them to inform about the occupiers, the collaborators, and just to give us fresh information what's going on in the area. And people just started reporting.
How far west have you caught some of these people?
Да, виявляли в тих же самих Чернівцях, в тому ж самому Закарпатті.
It's almost on the border, like in
По всій території України.
Chernivtsi.
Has Poland found some of these people on their side of the border?
Відповідно, тому що це одна, якщо ми говоримо про...
The cooperation response is very high on that because almost 90% of all military assistance comes through Polish territory. So it's naturally that we are cooperating on this issue.
Через те ми говоримо, що у нас співпраця з нашими партнерами вона дуже тісна.
Therefore, we are talking about very tight cooperation and joint operations with our partners.
And have the British and Americans and others helped in this regard?
Без цього просто неможливо на сьогоднішній день.
It's impossible without them in these.
What assistance have they provided?
Що стосується воєнної розвідки,
as far as military intelligence is concerned, it's almost everything, starting from information, equipment, and if we're talking about information, it's almost minute into minute, so it's real-time information.
Of what though? What are the radio intercepts, or are you using overhead, or what are the British providing?
Всі види розвідки, які є.
all kind of.
Is your coverage of Russia's system the most valuable intelligence capability that you are able to offer external partners? How valuable is that to the British and the Americans and others?
Я думаю, що це теж важливо. Чому? Тому що вони вивчають точно.
Yes, it's definitely in demand from our partners, because we're not talking merely about the security in Ukraine, but it is already about security in Eastern Europe and eastern flank of NATO countries and Europe as a whole.
How close to the targeting cycle are the US getting with the HIMARS? I can't imagine they're actually giving you the coordinates to hit, but are they verifying information you give them before you launch strikes?
Я вже, в принципі, говорив, що ми використовуємо саме от в багатьох випадках, а в цьому випадку...
As I mentioned, in most cases, and in this particular case, in this case in particular, we use the real-time information. And here we work not just with Americans, but with the other partners, and this enables us to make very quick decisions and be very efficient in a particular moment of time.
And are you able to task British and American satellites?
Я не знаю, які там є американські, або британські, але іміджери ми маємо.
I can't tell you whether they're British or Americans, but we have very good satellite imagery.
Now, in Britain, General Jim Hockenhull, who was our Chief of Defence Intelligence, has just been promoted to be the Head of Strategic Command, so Defence Intelligence, Special Forces, Space, other bits and pieces. Do you work closely with General Jim? Are you pleased to see this promotion? How close is your relationship with Britain in the military intelligence world?
Да, ми працюємо з нашими партнерами. Більш того, це, мабуть, не для інтерв'ю, я не закінчую.
We have very good cooperation with all the partners in UK in this area, in this field, and so we have very well established communication with the current heads of all the sister organizations in your country. With UK military intelligence, we've been working for a long time, since the time when our regiment was also doing their service in Iraq. And our assessment is that British analysts, intelligence analysts, they are one of the best in the world.
Just finally, there's a lot of rumours about Mr. Putin's health. Are you able to tell me anything that is not already in the public domain about Vladimir Putin? That you have gleaned from your network about his health or his personal attitude to this war? Or
дуже багато інформації стосовно його здоров'я. Однозначно, що він хворий.
There are plenty of information about his health, and definitely he's not in a healthy condition, both physically and mentally. And he is infamous of using a lot doubles, his twins, his doubles, just instead of him. This is a factor which is known to everyone. And sometimes it's difficult to detect whether there is a real Putin or someone who is replacing him. But his inner circle, some of them are quite panicking about his real condition of health and about those decisions that he is taking at the moment.
Mr. Skibitsy, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. You're welcome.
I hope we meet again.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, making her debut with the Telegraph social team, Claire Hubble.